Life has an odd way of threading together the unexpected, blending sorrow and mystery until they become indistinguishable. My story began on a cold November night, when the first twist of fate entered my childhood. A memory etched into my mind so vividly that even now I can feel the chill of that evening. I was 5 years old at the time, and my grandfather had just come home from another evening spent gambling and drinking. Since my grandmother's death, he had turned to alcohol, gambling, and lost himself in the chaos of it all. It wasn't unusual to find him stumbling through the front door late at night, his heavy steps echoing in the dark hallway. But that night, something was different. He came home, as always, drunk and weary, but he didn't make it to the sofa. He collapsed somewhere in the hallway. A part of me, even as a child, was used to this sight. Grandfather sleeping it off in random places had become a sad routine. So, that night, I didn't think much of it as I tiptoed past his still figure, making my way to the bathroom. But there was something in the air that I couldn't shake, something that felt off, even if I was too young to fully understand it. The house was dark, save for the dim light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows through the windows. I needed to turn on the light, but I couldn't reach the switch. It was right above where my grandfather had slumped. Hesitant, I approached him. "Grandpa, wake up," I whispered, nudging his arm gently. He didn't stir. "Grandpa," I said louder, but still there was nothing. Just silence. Fear began to crawl up my spine. His stillness was unnerving in a way that I hadn't experienced before. In a small voice, I called out, "Mom, I need to go to the bathroom." "Grandpa won't wake up." My mother appeared moments later, her presence a source of comfort. She knelt down beside him, shaking his shoulder. At first, she didn't seem worried, but then the look on her face shifted, turning into something darker. Her eyes widened as she touched his cheek, then his chest, searching for a pulse. Her voice, trembling with panic, broke the silence. Dad, wake up!" But there was no answer. I watched, frozen in place, as she realized the truth before any of us did. She rushed out the door, calling for the neighbor, an older woman who worked as a nurse. She arrived swiftly, carrying with her that stethoscope I could never remember the name of, the one doctors used to listen to the heartbeat. A few tense moments passed before she looked at my mother with sorrowful eyes, shaking her head. "He's gone." The words hung in the air like a curse. Even at 5, I understood what they meant. Death had entered our home, quiet and unnoticed, slipping into my grandfather's life and taking it with a cruel finality. My mother broke into hysterics, sobbing and clutching his lifeless form. I stood there, paralyzed, not knowing how to react. My uncle, Sergei, arrived soon after, and the grief spread like a virus. Calls were made, and I was quickly sent to stay with a neighbor for the night, leaving the grown-ups to deal with the aftermath. The funeral was a blur of black clothing, teary faces, and somber whispers. In the tradition of our small town, my grandfather's body was laid out in our living room in an open coffin before being taken to the cemetery. But in the chaos of planning the burial, a strange mistake had been made. At his workplace, his colleagues, with the best intentions, had also arranged for a coffin. So there we were with 2 coffins for one body. Superstition ran deep in our community, and people began to murmur about how it was an omen, how it wasn't a good sign to have 2 coffins. My mother waved it off, too consumed by grief to care about such things. But the whispers followed us all the way to the cemetery. The burial proceeded as expected, and afterward we all gathered at a small cafe nearby for the customary meal. It was a time to remember the deceased, to share stories, and to ease the weight of grief. As the afternoon wore on, people began to leave in small groups, dispersing back to their lives, as one does after a funeral. That's when the second twist of fate occurred. One of my grandfather's colleagues, a man I had seen earlier at the cemetery, was heading toward the bus stop across from the cafe. No one knows exactly how it happened. Maybe he didn't see it coming, or maybe it was just terrible timing, but the bus struck him, killing him instantly. The news spread like wildfire, and it wasn't long before someone mentioned the second coffin. It was waiting, unused, and now it had found its occupant. The whispers from earlier returned. Only this time they were filled with more than just superstition. They carried the weight of fear. 2 coffins, one for my grandfather and one for his colleague, now both filled by death's hand. People said the second coffin was never meant to remain empty. Looking back on that time, I still don't fully understand what happened. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe there was something darker at play, something beyond our understanding. But even now, as an adult, the memory of that November night, the 2 coffins, and the death that followed so closely behind haunts me. Some things in life remain mysteries, and sometimes the past clings to us like a shadow we can't shake. But I know one thing for sure: life, in all its unpredictability, will always find ways to remind us of its fragility. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, or at least as normal as it could be after losing someone so central to our lives. My mother, still in deep grief, threw herself into organizing my grandfather's belongings, selling the house, and dealing with the financial matters that come after a loss. Meanwhile, Sergei moved in to help us out, providing some much-needed support for my mother, who seemed to age overnight from the weight of her sorrow. But for me, the world never quite returned to the way it was. It wasn't just the death of my grandfather that lingered in my mind. It was something else, something more sinister, something I couldn't explain, but always felt just beneath the surface of my thoughts. The memory of that second coffin haunted me in a way I couldn't shake. The town's whispers about it never really died down, and neither did the sense of eerie wrongness that seemed to surround the whole event. As a 5-year-old, I didn't have the words to express what I was feeling, but I knew deep down that something unnatural had taken place. I could feel it in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the shadows seemed to move on their own. My mother, ever the practical woman, refused to acknowledge the strange coincidences that had begun piling up. But I noticed them. It wasn't just the fact that the second coffin had found its occupant so quickly. It was the dreams that started coming to me at night. Dark and twisted visions that always involved my grandfather. In these dreams, he was never resting peacefully. Instead, he was walking through the same dark hallway where I had last seen him, his face twisted in a pained expression, as though he was trying to tell me something but couldn't speak. Sometimes I would see the second coffin in the background, looming over him like a shadow. Each time I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as I stared into the darkness, waiting for the feeling of dread to pass. I tried to tell my mother once, but she dismissed it as the result of too much stress from the funeral. "You're too young to be worrying about these things," she would say. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But I knew better. Something was wrong, and I couldn't escape it. It was a late winter evening when the next strange event occurred. Sergei had gone out to pick up groceries, leaving my mother and me alone in the house. She had fallen asleep on the couch after a long day of work, and I was quietly playing with my toys on the floor, trying to distract myself from the unease that always seemed to creep in as night fell. That's when I heard it, a soft knock coming from the front door. It was so faint that at first I wasn't even sure it had happened, but then it came again, louder this time. I froze, staring at the door, waiting for my mother to wake up and check, but she remained fast asleep. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything and stay safely inside. But something else, the same curiosity that had driven me to approach my grandfather that fateful night, pulled me toward the door. I stood up, my small feet padding softly across the floor, and slowly made my way to the entrance. My hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating, but then the knock came again, more insistent this time. Gathering my courage, I opened the door. There was no one there. For a moment, I felt a strange relief wash over me. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it really was just my mind playing tricks on me, like my mother had said. But then I looked down. Sitting on the doorstep was something I hadn't expected to see. An envelope, old and yellowed, with my grandfather's name written on it in shaky handwriting. My heart began to race as I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. There was no return address, no stamp, nothing to suggest where it had come from. But there was no mistaking the handwriting. It was my grandfather's. I stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity, torn between opening it and running to wake my mother. But some deep, instinctual part of me knew that this was meant for me. I carefully peeled back the seal and pulled out the letter inside. The paper was thin and fragile, as though it had been kept somewhere for a long time. And as I began to read, my blood ran cold. "Sarah," it began, using my mother's name. "I know by now you found the second coffin. There are things I never told you, things I didn't want you or the boy to know. But the truth is there's more to our family than you realize. The second coffin wasn't a mistake. It was meant to be there. There is something you need to understand. Something dark, something that has followed us for generations. It is with me now, but soon it will be with you." I stopped reading, my hands shaking, but I forced myself to continue. I tried to outrun it. I thought I could protect you by keeping it hidden, but it's too late now. The second coffin, it is a symbol of the curse that has always plagued our family. Whoever is buried in it will not rest, not truly. They will return, but not as you remember them. They will return to claim what is theirs. I couldn't read any further. The words swam before my eyes as a wave of nausea hit me. I dropped the letter, backing away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows in the house seemed to close in around me, and suddenly the room felt much colder than before. I turned to look at my mother, still asleep on the couch, oblivious to everything. For the first time, I understood why she had always been so quick to dismiss the strange occurrences in our lives. She didn't want to believe in the darkness that had always lingered at the edges of our family's history. But now I had no choice. The second coffin wasn't just a coincidence. It was a warning, and whatever was coming, it wasn't finished with us yet. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the discarded letter as the weight of the words sank deeper into my mind. The second coffin, a curse that followed our family. My hands trembled as a realization crept in like a cold shadow. It wasn't over. Whatever my grandfather had tried to warn us about, it was coming. The air in the house felt thick and heavy, pressing down on me with an invisible weight. I turned and looked at my mother again, her peaceful sleep now seeming far too calm in the midst of what I had just learned. I wanted to wake her, to tell her about the letter, but fear rooted me to the spot. How could I explain something like this? Even if I did, what could we possibly do? My mind raced with questions. Why had no one ever told me about the curse? Why had my grandfather kept it a secret? And what did it mean that the person buried in the second coffin would return? A sound snapped me out of my spiraling thoughts. A creak, soft but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned toward the source of the noise. The hallway was dark, but I could just make out the outline of someone standing there. "Mom," I whispered, though I knew it wasn't her. She was still on the couch, sound asleep. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, and for a moment I thought my mind was playing tricks on me again. But then, ever so slowly, the figure began to shift, stepping forward into the faint light coming from the living room. My breath caught in my chest as the figure emerged from the shadows. It was him, my grandfather. But this wasn't the man I remembered. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. His clothes were the same as the ones we had buried him in, but they hung loosely on his withered frame. There was something wrong about the way he moved, unnatural, as though he were being pulled forward by some unseen force. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, to reconcile the kind man I had once known with the horrifying figure that now stood before me. "Grandpa!" I managed to choke out. He didn't respond. His eyes were locked on mine, but there was no recognition in them, no warmth, just a cold, empty stare. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the letter still lying on the floor. I needed to wake my mother, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It was as if the fear had paralyzed me. That's when he spoke. His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but the words cut through the air like a knife. "They will come for you." A chill ran down my spine. Who was they? What did he mean? "Grandpa, please," I stammered, my voice shaking. "What's happening? Why are you here?" His expression didn't change, but he took another step toward me, his movements jerky and unnatural. "The curse! It never ends," he whispered. I tried to stop it, but I failed. "Now it's your turn. My turn," I echoed, my mind reeling. "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, the shadows in the hallway seemed to ripple and shift, and suddenly the temperature in the room dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air, and the feeling of dread intensified. Something else was here. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Another figure, darker and more menacing, was emerging from the hallway. It was larger than my grandfather, its form distorted and twisted, as though it didn't quite belong in this world. My grandfather's head turned slowly toward the new arrival, and for the first time I saw a flicker of fear in his hollow eyes. "They are here," he whispered. "Run!" I didn't need to be told twice. My body finally snapped into action, and I bolted for the couch, shaking my mother awake. "Mom, wake up!" I cried, my voice trembling with terror. She stirred, groggy and disoriented. "What's going on?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "There's no time," I urged, pulling her to her feet. "We need to get out of here, now." She must have sensed the urgency in my voice because she didn't ask any more questions. She quickly grabbed her coat, and we ran for the door. But as we reached the threshold, I glanced back one last time. My grandfather was still standing in the hallway, his eyes locked on the dark figure that had now fully emerged from the shadows. It was taller than any human, its form shifting and pulsating as though it were made of pure darkness. It loomed over my grandfather, its presence suffocating and malevolent. And then, without warning, the figure lunged toward him. I didn't stay to watch what happened next. I slammed the door behind us, and we fled into the night. For the next few days, my mother and I stayed with Sergei. I didn't tell her about what I had seen that night, nor did I mention the letter. She was already dealing with so much grief, and I didn't want to burden her with something she wouldn't believe. Instead, I kept the truth to myself, trying to make sense of it on my own. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. My grandfather's warning echoed in my mind. "They will come for you." Who or what were they? And why were they after us? The answers came sooner than I expected. It was late one night when I awoke to strange sound coming from the hallway outside the guest room where I was staying. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The house was dark and quiet, save for the steady tapping that seemed to be getting closer. I crept out of bed, my pulse quickening with every step. As I reached the door, the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then a voice, faint and distant, whispered from the darkness, "They are here." The shadows in the hallway began to shift, and I knew, without a doubt, that the curse had found me.